Peace and love, family, and welcome back to the channel. For those watching from another channel or just watching me for the first time, my name is Brother93, and in this video it's going to be both a response and an example on how to identify and counter bad arguments like slander, ad hominem attacks, and so forth. The subject of scrutiny here in this video is recent dejected Hebrew Israelite Jashub ben Issachar, or more recently Jashub ben Bantu. He runs the small YouTube channel known as Genesis49ers. He's rumored to be a former member of the Camp Hebrew Israelites. His channel seems to be dedicated to topics relevant to African Americans, features debates, discussions, and occasionally slander. That's all what's featured on his channel. He is the head of a group of independent researchers called the YAP Gang, in reference to men who paternally descend from the DE haplogroup, with a focus on E1B1A. He has gone from arguing from sources pertaining to the transatlantic slave trade to shifting to a more scientific genetics-based approach. But regardless of when he made this switch, for some reason he has focused on making some very emotional posts and videos, making personal attacks on me and African people in a rather pathetic attempt to discredit and malign me. Now, I'm not 100% sure about what about me is intimidating him or getting under his skin and making him behave that way, but what I will do is examine the only legitimate argument he could have had, which in of itself is demonstrably false. So what we gotta do is rewind back to November 26, 2020, and Jashub presented slides from what would have been a debate against Rabon, who was an associate of mine, but Rabon rejected him. He didn't want to debate him. He don't want nothing to do with him, right? So Jashub's objective with those slides was to prove that Hebrews were among the descendants of the slave trade. So on January 31st, 2021, I made a video on Garfield's Dagger Squad platform rebutting his arguments. Admittedly, it's not my best work, we've all grown since that point. But even so, Jashub was at least exposed, misquoting sources and omitting information from the sources. Now, sometime shortly after that, he began to study DNA and shifted to making genetic arguments. So in the fall of 2021, he had a bad showing against Christian apologists faithful to God, resulting in an emotional rant on his end, and a response via Faithful to God and Giassi and Gozi on the Faithful to God channel. By the spring of 2022, he went on to make an attack video on me in the paternal lineage haplogroup A, which I discovered I had via 23andMe test. Haplogroup A is a rare ancient African lineage said to go back some 100,000 years or more. It's extremely rare amongst African Americans, and 1 in 6,200 23andMe customers have it. It represents the oldest human male lineage in the world. Modern day hunter-gatherer groups like the Khoisan, the Pygmies, and Nilotic people share this line of descent, although it is found in small frequencies somewhere like in Europe and even in some Bantu groups, because some of the men were absorbed into those people who took over Africa, right? So his point of attack on me seems to be that African hunter-gatherers that had the A and even B lineages were displaced and killed and absorbed by the migrating Bantu peoples who introduced haplogroup E as the predominant lineage of sub-Saharan Africa. Now, he's probably delusional enough to think that any intellectual arguments between me and him are some kind of pseudo-continuation of the tension between farming Bantus or what he deems as a descendant of primitive hunter-gatherers or whatever kind of thing that plays out in his mind. But, the mention of someone's genetic origin as an attack, it doesn't warrant a serious response, especially like I never really took it more than just trolling, but it just really shows that Jashub, he isn't above petty insults when he feels threatened. But if this were a debate, he would be losing. I mean, that's like really a genetic fallacy, like literally. Now let's fast forward to last weekend when I appeared on Bahrain TV. It was in the aftermath of the Orthodox Moor and Garfield debate. I happened to see Jashub on a panel, And after questioning him on when exactly he abandoned his Hebrew beliefs, I managed to trigger his anxiety. I got him to commit intellectual, I don't know if I could say this on YouTube, but let's say intellectual quit the game of life in front of Bareen's audience. Now that was embarrassing. Let's take a listen.
Come on, Issachar, come to the microphone. You want to put your screen up? I'm gonna give you like 15 minutes to if you want to share your thoughts. I don't know if you want to share your thoughts in general on something different. You got association affiliation with YAP Gang also. Some people might be troubled because of what Garfield said.
Nigga, I am YAP. What are you talking about? I'm YAP.
Oh, okay. All right. There you go. All right, we're going to mind the language now. We're going to mind the language. I'm going to give you 15 minutes. You want to put your screen up?
I don't even support the Israelite argument no more. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't even care.
What? Oh, really?
I don't care for it. I don't even support the Israelite argument no more. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't even support the Israelite argument no more. I'm going to be honest with you. And no, I don't support the Israelite argument no more. I don't support it because it's the same thing Garfield's doing. It's in the same vein.
When did you give it up?
Give up what?
You said you left that argument alone. So when did this happen?
Because just like you and Garfield, y'all make silly arguments on the internet.
I just said when, sir. I said when.
All right, I'm explaining. Now, what the hell your damn name is? I'm explaining.
You can read when.
When? Over the last year. I don't really make arguments for Israelites no more.
So why you keep my name in your mouth if the only thing we disagree about is the Hebrew thing, the lineal?
Because you have garbage methodology. Your methodology sucks. Just like the Black Hebrew Israelites methodology sucks.
It sucks.
Your methodology is the problem.
Jews into genetics. Your methodology, you had to give up being a Hebrew.
What are you talking about? Your methodology sucks. If you're telling somebody they can't be a part of an ancestry, 93. If you're saying somebody can't be a part of your argument, bro, shut up when I'm talking, bro. It's my floor, bro. Shut the fuck up while I'm talking.
Shut up when I'm talking.
Yo, why you don't curse, bro? Don't curse.
Tell him to stop interrupting me, man. I fucking
love it.
If you would let me.
You's a softy. Kick him off the chat. Kick him up out of here. He's soft. He's soft.
Now, in that clip, my microphone was kind of muffled. I sounded a little low, and perhaps people couldn't clearly hear me. But I asked him when. When did he stop arguing to be a Hebrew? He said sometime last year. Then I asked him why he was continuing to personally attack me if all we disagreed about was the Hebrew Israelite thing, whether we were that or not. So if he gave it up, there would be no there would be really no problem between us. And his response was that I have bad methodology, and he conflated me and Garfield's kind of arguments together instead of dealing with me on an individual basis. He thinks I have the same kind of rationale as the camps. He think I got the same kind of rationale as a ISUPK or a regular Hebrew Israelite. And that's justification for personal attacks and ad hominems. Wow. So bad methodology warrants personal attacks on not only me, but making light of African people who you say got haplogroup A and B that actually suffer in real life because they share lineage with me. You attacking me by attacking them. Bad methodology led him to make videos describing me as a hoe or a BITCHASSNIGGA, because that's what you got on your channel right now. Bad methodology leads to that. You're somebody who would scrutinize somebody's methodology from like a scholarly perspective, but then you act unscholarly and you act uncivilized and you act like a very effeminate man just because somebody has bad methodology. I've encountered Hebrew Israelites who I perceived as having bad methodology all the time. As a matter of fact, in 2021, I was arguing with Dante Fortson and the brother Tazarah, who I know, like I argue with all the time. I can criticize their methodology, but I don't believe I got no video personally attacking or calling them epithets or calling them hoes or BITCHs and all of that. Wow. So does he even know my methodology? I mean, he should, because he claims that it's bad. I mean, you got to know it to say that it's bad, right? I'm more than certain this is not about information and this is extremely personal on his end. But let's entertain this excuse for his feminine behavior, and we're going to dissect both his and my own methodology within the last 2 years. So, returning to his 2020 video, we see him making the case for descendants of Hebrews coming amongst the slaves in the transatlantic slave trade. So let's look at 2 of his sources he cites, and let's see his interpretation of the sources, and let's look at his methodology at that time period.
We get now, I'm building up to it, man. This is the build up to answer the question. The progeny of the Jews returned to their ancestral religion. Progeny means the children and the descendants of. The source I'm looking at is The Jews and Blacks in the Early Modern World by Jonathan Scorch. It's a very good book. I think it's going to run you about $70 on Amazon. Page number 253. As J.D. Oppenheim remarked, it was especially among the house of slaves that many Jewish traditions were known and were looked upon as master law, remain more or less in the memories of their offsprings. Now, this presentation is going to explain to you how all these Jews, all these slaves were able to retain these Jewish traditions, and their offsprings retain these Jewish traditions. Now, many will say that scoff, it's because they were converts and they had Jewish slave masters. There weren't that many Jewish slave masters in the Americas. A very small percentage of Jews had slaves in America. So you're going to say all these damn slaves understood these Jewish traditions based off this small amount of Ashkenazim that came over here like in the late 1700s? Doesn't make any sense. We're gonna explain to you on the source why these Jewish traditions were held near and dear to these slaves and how they retained it and how was these traditions transmitted.
Okay, so here's his slide right here, right? It says the progeny or children of Jews return, keyword return, to their ancestral religion. Don't mind what I put right here about the page numbers, because in the digital and the physical versions they could differ. But right here we see he quoted about the house slaves knowing Jewish tradition or master law, right? And his presentation is about Hebrews being amongst the slaves that came through the slave trade, because that was the litmus. Did they come through the slave trade, right? This is J.D. Oppenheim. So we're going to go to the footnote to show you the primary source. At least in my methodology, I do show that, right? By J.D. Oppenheim, Jewish Customs Among the Suriname. Then we're going to go to Jonathan Schorsch's source that he used. And let's see what he left out. It says, as J.D. Oppenheim remarked, it was especially among the house slaves that many Jewish traditions were known and looked upon as master law. But what he didn't tell y'all right here was about the children of the Jewish planters and their female slaves or mulattoes, having been born out of wedlock after the manumission of their mothers, were instructed by their mothers of whom they were born and took the name of Portuguese Jews. This implies that only that these women slaves who worked in the house saw enough of Jewish life to want to share it or recognized the possibility of social betterment within the community that their children would gain as Jews. It says the mothers instructed these children to take on Portuguese Jewish names. And it also says the names that would claim and signify their Jewish ancestry. So they're getting it from their mothers, the black slave women. So how would this be a return to their ancestral religion? It's not ancestral because their fathers are Sephardic Jews who migrated there. They wasn't slaves. The slaves were the women who weren't slaves, were given their religion and instructed their children to have it, even gave the children names. It does not prove that, at least these sources don't prove his premise that amongst the slaves, Hebrews came, because the Sephardic Jews wasn't slaves. They converted black women and had children. The women gave it to the children. Speaking of Suriname, which is not the United States, which is not where our ancestors went, he quoted Bruce D. Haynes' book, Soul of Judaism, to talk about the patrilineal descent of Sephardic Jews. But his premise is about Jews coming amongst the slaves in the slave trade. And it's funny because the Sephardic Jews, they immigrated to the New World and took slaves. So him having this quote, he didn't even show you in the book and on the page where this exact section talks about conversion. Talks about them having slaves who they had children with. Look at right here. Frequently, Jewish men converted female African slaves so they can marry them as Jews. In some cases, slaves were emancipated following their conversion to Judaism. We go down the way he quoted, right there where it says Jews subscribe to ancient practice of patrilineal descent. It's right there, right above it, right to the side. Immediately preceding this stuff, it talks about the conversion, and he was just criticizing that and talking about how it wasn't a lot of Jewish slave masters and all that stuff. Is that proper methodology? I know this is the past. I know it is, but I'm just showing at a time period when my methodology was largely the same as it was today. He had a whole different methodology that was flawed. He was omitting things. He was leaving things out. Stuff doesn't even support his argument.
Is effacing history in favor of hyphenated whiteness. The source I'm about to go into is The Jews and Blacks in Early Modern World by Jonathan Scorch, page number 286. It says the history of the colored Jews born of racial sex in their congregation underwent almost complete erasure from the authors. I want you to understand that. Complete erasure from the authors. So that means people purposely try to remove this history, erase this history, or efface this history, snip it out of the historical records because they didn't want this to be seen. This is just facts. And you got a lot of you Afrocentrics that's banking on that because you want to push this black ideology, this African-only ideology that you're African and that's it, which is all pseudonyms, right? It's not a true identity that was held by the ancestors, right? So you look for this absence of evidence, so to speak, in favor of your erroneous arguments. When we can clearly see Jonathan Scorch is telling you that this history almost got completely wiped out. The question is why. Let's move on.
So here's another one of his sources. It says the history of colored Jews born of transracial sex and their congregation underwent almost complete erasure from the authors. This is Jonathan Scorch, and we go to the book. He left this out. Sephardic Whiteness in Suriname. The history of colored Jews born of Sephardic transracial sex and their congregation underwent almost complete erasure from the authors. Jewish mulattoes receiving barely a mention in passing. So these are the children of black women who were not Jews, who were given that Jewish slave masters, and their children are mulattoes, who they passed down the Jewishness to. This is in Suriname, by the way, so it's not even African American history. So I don't see how his methodology at this time period isn't flawed, but mine's got to be flawed, right? And even when he upgrades his methodology, we see him doing the same stuff. Now we see neither of these sources proves his point about Jewish descendants via slavery. Rather, it just shows migrating Jews that made progeny with black African slaves. Now that's not to say all of his points were wrong or that he didn't provide examples that could be sound, but multiple times he omits parts of the sources and he doesn't present the proper context, which is bad scholarship. I don't want to go through every slide and everything he said because I did that in the video 2 years ago. Plus, now he has changed his stance on that, but the point was to show that in the past he had bad methodology.
You have garbage methodology. Your methodology sucks. Just like the Black Hebrew Israelites methodology sucks. You have garbage methodology.
Liar! Liar! Now this is what he says about me, but let's look at my quote-unquote methodology. Let's look at my reason and how I argue as far as lineage and phenotype and morphology and all of that. Let's look, and this is 2 years ago. Let's see if this is something that he would disagree with right now. So right here, we got color, dark skin, swarthy, or black Hebrews of history. Now, having dark skin or black skin doesn't make you the ancestors of African Americans or the African diaspora. If ancient Hebrews were in fact the people of color, it makes them no more our ancestors than the Dravidians Aboriginal Australians, Arabs, the Roma people, aka Gypsies, Southeast Asians, Indigenous Americans, or Negritos. By tracing lineage through your fathers, the Y DNA of Hebrews, Sephardim, Jews in particular should be EM2, E1B1A, or its various subclades, the same as West, South, Central African tribes taken to America as slaves. So if these Jews are dark, it don't automatically mean they're your people if they're described as dark. I don't understand where that logic leads, especially when you know anything about anthropology. There's people all over the world of color. The Jews could have color, and that don't automatically mean they're your ancestors. Come on, man. Don't be that desperate. Now, there we go. There you go right there. I still have this stance, and I maintain it like today. Now, unlike Jashub, I'm not forced to change my methodology or worldview by that much since that time frame. Yes, I've argued color just for the sake of arguing it with people or whatever like that, but truly, the bit of genetics, the bit of knowledge I knew about lineage at the time, I knew just being black doesn't make you anything. So I don't argue like the camps. I wasn't arguing like the camps back then, so he's wrong. He wasn't paying attention. So moving ahead to the fall of 2021, Jashub became a dilettante in genetics. Now, dilettante being a word he projected upon his own opponents, despite being a living embodiment of it. Like, Faithful to God would expose Jashub's habit of omitting information in context regarding information and sources and, this scientific paper here in this clip. Let's take a listen.
And what I'm going to do very quickly before we get into the actual topic, I got one more thing to play. This was actually from Jashub's show. I believe this was from the 29th. And this was a clip in which he attempted to cast aspersions on J1. So he read an article, although he never showed it on his screen. And it was an article entitled Origin and Diffusion of Human Y Chromosome Haplogroup J1-M267. So I'm going to go ahead and play the clip. I'm going to show it on my screen, and you guys are going to see something in a moment.
So we're going to read the origin and diffusion of J1M267, which is where they say the Cohen monohaplotype comes from. All right, so in this paper, it states, here we study past human male demography in West Asia with 172 high coverage whole Y chromosome sequences and 889 genotype samples of haplogroup J1M267. We show that the haplogroup evolved 20,000 years ago somewhere in northwestern Iran, the Caucasus, the Armenian highland, and northern Mesopotamia. This is not the Levant. The major branch, here it goes, J1A1A1 P58 evolved during the early Holocene 9,500 years ago somewhere in the Arabian Peninsula, southern Mesopotamia. Haplogroup J1M267 expanded during the Chalcolithic, the Bronze Age, and Iron Age. So prior to this, you don't have this haplogroup here. 9,500 years ago somewhere in the Arabian Peninsula, southern Mesopotamia. Haplogroup J1M267 expanded during the
So I want you guys to catch that. Did you notice that he was reading the paper? But when he got to the portion that says, 9,500 years ago, somewhere in the Arabian Peninsula, and then he skipped over the part where it says the Levant, and then went right to and southern Mesopotamia. So he ignored the part that said the Levant and just read, it's impossible to read that paper and not see that part. And I'm going to show you guys, because this is on my screen. This right-hand side, this doesn't actually appear in his live stream. This was added into the video so everyone could see the actual paper. He never actually showed the paper in his live stream. The left-hand side is what was in his live stream, so he doesn't actually show this paper. You guys can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you.
So it's interesting that he did that. So here's the relevant paper, which I'm about to show. And I'm going to show you guys that it is impossible to read that paper. Even though I had it on the screen, it was on the right-hand side, but some might accuse me of photoshopping or whatever the case is. But it is impossible to actually read that paper the way that he did and to miss the relevant portion. Now, if I could find the me actually find that. Here we go. Hold on one second. Yeah, here we go. This was the relevant portion in the paper. You guys can see that, right? Actually, you know what? Let me do something real quick. Let me make this text a little larger, and then you guys will be able to. It is virtually impossible to read that and miss that portion. Just skip over that portion.
Here's a clip from the comments section mentioning my video on him. Thought that was kind of funny. But yeah, something interesting is the live chat of my 2021 video. We see Sabio, he's a former Dagger Squad member. He mentioned that he sent the video to Jashub. Then Jashub commented on the video some years later, you know, that it was his first time watching the video or whatever. But if he did watch it early this year or whatever, whenever you watched it, like, how did he miss me explaining my views on lineage being more important than morphology? How could he attack my methodology when even he can agree with what I'm saying here in this old video while I was critiquing him? Also, take notice to the fact that he's saying, I can make videos, but I won't debate. But if he was telling the truth in the recent video when he said, oh, I gave up the Hebrew argument sometime last year, then there wouldn't be anything for me and him to debate. That's the only thing me and him disagreed on or had a real debate upon. So it seems like he just want to debate just for the sake of debating, just because he don't like me, just because he wants to be a contrarian, he wants to be antagonistic. He doesn't even have a legit beef, and he's talking about debates, but he's given up the Hebrew argument, and that's the only thing I really disagree with him and the Hebrews on. It wasn't about methodology. He didn't voice methodology here. I got such a bad methodology that in this video where I showed you my views, my methodology as far as lineage, he went through the DNA paradigm, left the Hebrew DNA paradigm, only to agree with what I was saying in that video. So it's not adding up. It's not legit. This guy just has a personal issue with me, yo. So sometime this year, Abu Kamar, he put a video out on E1B1A in the Levant. And on the video, I put a comment where I said that I believe at some time or in the future they could find E1B1A in Israel, just like they found it anywhere else, like they found it in Spain or like they found it all over the world. It would just prove that people with that lineage travel wherever they wanted to. It doesn't specifically mean that they were the Israelites. It could be stragglers. It could be just migrants, right? So I posted that, and I also said I believe that maybe they'll find a sample that's ancient in West Africa, right? Prior to the Israelite period. I put biblical Israelite period, whatever. You know, the guy, Jashub, he got real excited at the prospect of having a discussion with me because he came specifically to my comment. He even wanted to come on my channel and have a discussion about it, you know, and I ain't really care. It didn't matter to me. Just to return to my comments real quick, or these comments in particular on Abu's video, if he would have just read these comments, he would see the nuance that I'm trying to put forth in the conversation. You have people that won't even admit that E1B1A could, would, or ever will be found in the Levant. And I'm saying this, like, somebody with a poor methodology wouldn't even be speaking in this matter, right? So if you read that, I'm pretty sure he could agree with this. You look at his comment right here. I'm going to read his comment. I might even read it in his voice, because he got a Jim Henson-esque kind of voice. He got kind of a very interesting character type of voice. Let me see. Biblical Iron Age? What's that? Secondly, all of the evidence points to an external origin of modern Western Africans. DNA is integral, but coupled with other arguments, the veracity at this point is unassailable. Well, I'm not arguing about the origin of E1B1A. It could start in Arabia, it could start in Northeast Africa. That's not the point. I'm talking about whether E1B1A is the lineage of Hebrew Israelites. That's always been my argument. E can develop wherever it developed. That's a beautiful thing. I don't have any hatred or malice towards E carriers. That's ridiculous. That's what y'all do. I don't do that. But I'm not even arguing that. It seems like he's just trying to, If he can't be an Israelite, then he gonna throw the "E developed somewhere else" argument towards me, which I don't care. If it's true, I will acknowledge that. Look at this comment right here. Well, I had to speak to him about the Iron Age. I said the argument isn't about if E developed outside of Africa, rather if carriers of E3A here in the Americas are the descendants of Israelite. Such has not been proven, but I can appreciate anyone's efforts, permitted they argue in good faith. Does this sound like somebody with a terrible, horrible methodology the way I'm speaking to him? It's ridiculous. Look at what I said here. If it has been proven and demonstrated by credited geneticists that African Americans are the literal Israelites, I have no objection. Does that sound like somebody with a poor methodology? I said, just cite the paper and the geneticists that have proven that. We can't argue facts. A fact is a fact. I have no argument if it's proven. If there's people who look at the lineage and look at the line of the remains there and say that. I said a discussion, speculating or postulating is just for fun, but we all have done that for years now. I appreciate the evolution in your approach to the subject matter. Keep growing. Does that sound like somebody with a poor methodology? Even if I disagree with him, this guy's been personally attacking and disrespecting me. But am I displaying poor methodology by appealing to the actual science and evidence instead of me just making stuff up? He said, I argue like the camps. That's not how the camps argue. That's not how they reason.
You have garbage methodology. Your methodology sucks. Just like the Black Hebrew Israelites methodology sucks.
Now let's just finish this whole charge of my methodology being bad. That means there's open season for you to personally attack and cuss and disrespect me and act like a hooligan, like a man child, like a feminine girl, So the most recent display of my methodology was last week in a discussion on Bareen's channel with the Hebrew Israelite fella Tazarah Ban Yehuda. It was a competitive yet good-natured discussion where I made clear my views, and they're pretty much consistent with what I said 2 years ago in my response video to Jashub on the slave trade. Right. So let's listen to that clip.
Scriptural arguments are gonna be based on interpretation, and it's gonna lead to eisegesis and exegesis. I don't think that's a good method either. See, and then it's gonna come down to who interpretation is better, because the Christian apologists, for years, they've been given contrary examples how it's not exactly how Hebrew Israelites interpret it, about the hair color, about Christ and all of that stuff. And see, that stuff ad nauseum just leads me to say, And plus, I can't take the scripture interpretations of Deuteronomy 28, put it in a laboratory and get results. You're going to get false positives. I would say you have an aversion to DNA. I've learned about DNA. People don't like DNA. But I would say we're talking about a lineal claim, a lineage.
Right.
It produces less false positives than looking at somebody's hair, nose, and skin color, and it produces less false positives than my interpretation of a scripture, because so many other people got interpretations of scripture.
Right.
So we see me trying to reason with Tazarah and get away from morphological arguments, even scriptural interpretation, in order to prove who is who, and steer him towards a science like DNA, which is what obviously Jashub agreed with at a time, and through that means he came to the conclusion that he wasn't an Israelite, and that argument wasn't really sufficient. That methodology wasn't sufficient. See, he's the one going through all these different epochs in his worldview and all of this stuff, only to just come disagree with me. I didn't have to use the genetics. I just was saying that African Americans wasn't Israelites, and he had to go learn genetics to find out something that I was saying without having to learn genetics to the degree he probably had, because I already knew. So here's Orthodox Moore. He's a fellow member of Jashub's YAP Gang collective. He recently reshared the video of my conversation with Tazarah, and I'm certain he disagrees with me on at least some things, either in that conversation or just overall, but none of his feedback that he gave me after that conversation when I talked to him in Ivry, none of it included me having a horrible methodology. In fact, if you've seen the title of his recording of that discussion, it indicates that he may have disagreed more with Tazarah than he did with me. And I'm sure somewhere along the line we disagree on some things, but neither him or Avery made it a point to say you have horrible methodology. But even if they did feel that way, I've seen them encounter people who actually have bad methodology. I'm not going to say their names, but they've encountered people from the Hebrew and the Christian apologists and the non-believing sector, and they've displayed bad methodology going up against Moore and Avery. I've never seen Avery or Moore, not to my knowledge, make videos personally attacking any of those people, calling them a hoe or bitch or all of this kind of stuff Jashub is doing. And if you think about it, when Jashub came on, he actually said me and Garfield kind of have the same kind of issues like the camps.
Because just like you and Garfield, y'all make silly arguments. Because just like you and Garfield, y'all make silly arguments. Because just like you and Garfield, y'all make silly arguments.
So if that was true, Moore encountered Garfield, and if Moore felt the same way about Garfield's methodology being poor, I wonder why in their debate I didn't see Moore calling Garfield out of his name, calling him a B, calling him a hoe, making all types of slanderous videos about him. Instead of what I have seen Moore do is go at Garfield's scholarship and actually go at his methodology, actually go at his sources and his arguments. That's what Orthodox Moore would do. I believe that's what Avery would do too. Seems like the other members of YAP are far more sophisticated, far more emotionally mature in how they go about dealing with poor arguments than the person who seems to be the head of that collective. What a shame. So to sum it all up, Jashubis went from being a Hebrew who didn't even believe in DNA to displaying poor methodology when presenting sources at the end of 2020 to a year later being equally deceptive after learning about DNA. And now he exhibits an inability to do actual research on the people he chooses to criticize. He even asked Tazarah, the individual who I had a discussion with on Bareen's channel, to come on his show and talk about the dialogue that me and him had. Now, mind you, he doesn't even like Tazarah. He doesn't agree with Tazarah. Tazarah argues closer to the camps than I do. But he would have this guy come on, a guy he don't even agree with, to have a discussion on what he talked about with me. He disliked me so much he would do that. And if I could just make a silly anime analogy, Jashub is just like Dragon Ball Z Vegeta levels of arrogant. Like when he fought Android 18, he thought because he was Super Saiyan he was going to beat everybody up. That's kind of like when he learned genetics, he was going to beat everybody up, and he said in the comments section he surpassed us all. Now that he's, I guess what he's dealing with genetics, so it's like he's Super Saiyan, and yeah, and the truth is like Android 18 kicking his behind, saying to him, "How sad to work so hard for so little." That's actually perfect. So no, his issue with me is just personal attacks. It's not about my methodology. He has nothing to stand on other than personal attacks. So here he is on Facebook. This was sent to me. He's saying, "Tell 93 my ancestors clapped them ends and took they bees," as in they women. Saying his ancestors killed hunter-gatherer men and took hunter-gatherer women. Here you go, pal. Have at it. So he says people like me are irrelevant because my paternal lineage is less than 4% of African American populations. Well, according to him, we must be relevant in his mind for him to put the haplogroup of A on the biblical Adam.
Yeah. So Noah Wood, his first initial 3 sons will have the same haplogroup as him.
Oh,
but I believe that Noah would have been what we call Y chromosomal Adam.
Then he put on his shout out to YAP, we merc hunter-gatherers. Sir, you just did a video appreciating haplogroup R1b. That is the lineage of our oppressors, our collective oppressors, European white people who slave traded Bantus, Icarian people, and some Acarian people in America. You know what? I'm going to have to go to Hashar for this one. Now, Jashub, I believe his haplogroup is EU290. I believe that began in the Congo. Listen to this conversation him and Ngozi had when Ngozi had made him admit his haplogroup is African.
And your E mutated in the Congo, in Central Africa. So you're not an Israelite. So you're not a Hebrew Israelite. Where did your E? Okay, let me ask you, Yashu, did your E1B1? Did your E1B1 mutate in the Levant? Did your E1B1 mutate in the Levant?
No, it did not. I already said that.
So you're not Israelite. So you're not Israelite. So you're not Israelite.
That's fine. But that doesn't change the fact that Martin Luther King.
So everybody heard him. Everybody heard him.
So he's got a haplogroup said to have originated in the Congo, but he's praising R1b, the haplogroup shared by the people who went into the Congo and oppressed those people. Leopold II being one of them. And it just so happens that his DNA is here for people to observe. I wonder what his haplogroup is. Man, you cannot make this stuff up. You cannot make this stuff up. This guy just got personal issues, man. I can't help him. All I can do is recommend him go somewhere quiet alone, let it out, and just cry, Jashu. Just cry. And I want to end this video by showing what the YAP is purported to believe at this point, and get them in proper context and not misrepresent them, and let them show what they believe regarding the Israelite argument. Nobody should lump them in as Hebrew Israelites or Hebrew Israelite apologists. They're independent researchers. They're interested in history. No different than me, no different than the Dagger Squad, no different than the Christian apologists. Do not lump them in. I think it's important not to misrepresent people. So I'm showing this to let them speak for themselves. As for Jashu, he's absolutely pathetic and so beneath me. He's really my grandchild. But now you got me talking junk. I really thought somebody who would call himself the scholastic bully would go about it scholastically, or would have some actual argument behind claiming my methodology was bad, but that's demonstrably false. He argues like a white supremacist, actually, and I could actually go back and forth with him and talk about quote-unquote primitive or savage or nasty habits of people with haplogroup E. That's just so time exhausting and wasting. I know he gonna make videos going back and forth and all that. I really don't care. I mean, he's my grandchild at the end of the day. So I want to shout out everybody who watched this video. Peace and love. Thanks for watching. I'm out.